Hello, I'm Finn from Fantastic Explanations. In this video I'm going to be talking about the book of Joshua. The reason for this is because I essentially just woke up and started thinking about the book of Joshua, which for me is a pretty complicated and strange text. I'm not assuming anyone has any background in the book of Joshua, and I'm by no means an archaeological expert on the history or the extreme reality of the background surrounding the book of Joshua. But what I do want to call into question are the various unknowns in the book of Joshua and be transparent that a lot of these are not known. So the book is named after Joshua, who's depicted as an apprentice and successor to Moses. This guy is essentially appointed by God to be something of a prophet and a military commander, as well as a sort of lawgiver. Moses is not allowed to enter the promised land, and Joshua is pretty much appointed to take his place. And the authorship of the book of Joshua is unknown. So most of what we have in terms of authorship is arguments. So types of sources for the book's composition are identifiable. There's city list in chapter 14 through 19, and if the book of Joshua was written in any of these things, it's really unknown. So it's very hard to say. There's older stories that are tradition. The book of Joshua is largely thought to be an etiology for why the tribes of Israel, the 12 tribes, why they live in certain places, at least during the authorship of the text. So that could be any time between probably kingship, so 10th century BC and 6th century BC, probably before the Babylonian exile. This is after the Pentateuch, the first 5 books. So this is actually in the Deuteronomic history, and so that's going to be like 6 books, and this starts the first of 5 books. The first of 6 books, and it completes the first 5 books, the Pentateuch. And it's actually these are called some of the historical books as well. It's classified in these, and it's called the Hexateuch by some people. And just to be clear, the historical books are actually a canonical organization of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah, and Esther. These books cover a lot of topics, a lot of genres, have a lot of characters, and they are more than just historical in tone. They are narratives, and they do have very different sections in the Bible. So they contain a lot of narratives that are interlocking and that go together, but they were essentially the historical books as a tradition or convention was first thought of by the Christian bishop Athanasius, which is a 4th century CE term. He just coined the term histories. So the historical books, it came from this era, came from that guy. So pretty much the book of Joshua, it has 2 parts. So the conquest, where Joshua and his troops, which are pretty much just the Israelites, or pre-Israelites. I mean, it depends on how you think of it, because the kingship, right, is where King David and there's various other kings have an established kingdom of Israel, and then later Judah. So there's these 2 kingdoms where you could call these people Israelites. These are pretty much ex-slaves and wanderers in the desert at this point. So they're not exactly Israelites, but they're certainly not Jews, and they don't really have a national identity until they go and conquer a new place. So the book of Joshua largely deals with this. Okay, so they conquer Canaan in the first, it's 12 sections. So 1:1 to 12.24 is going to be the conquest section, and the second part is the allotment of the land. Now, towards the end, in 24, well, I guess it's really 22 to 24, you start having an epilogue to all this. So it sort of starts to link into Judges. And one of the formal arguments that's made is that the book of Judges is essentially like a prelude to the various parts. I think I'm phrasing it wrong. The book of Joshua connects directly to the book of Judges, and it's not exactly known why this is, but one of the theories is that the two were at one point written together, and they were separated as the result of many additions, redactions, and translations of the Bible. So, and this started with the Septuagint, which is one of the Greek translations of the Old Testament. And so when people apparently put in section headings for translations, they don't get taken out, and it becomes a convention over time. And this seems to be the case with Joshua, although, again, this is not for sure known. This is an argument put forth that seems very cogent to me. So you can read this book as a straightforward history. It's just that a lot of details are minced in the story. The military campaigns are pretty vivid, although the time is a little bit mixed up in Joshua. It's not exactly clear what exactly is happening in terms of the time. Around 13, you get a section, and I'll read this. Joshua 13 says, "Now Joshua was old and advanced in years, and the Lord said to him, 'You are old and advanced in years, and very much of the land still remains to be possessed. This is the land that still remains, all the regions of the Philistines, and all those of the Geshurites, from Sheor, east of Egypt, northward to the boundary of Ekron. It is reckoned as Canaanite. There are 5 rulers of the Philistines." Anyway, it just goes on. My reason for bringing this section up is that Joshua is supposed to be old now, and someone else is going to have to take up the mantle. Now, the Philistines, this is coming up. They're going to eventually fight the Philistines. God will triumph over them, and it's not really important to the Joshua narrative, just that it's definitely connected to different other parts in the historical books. And I believe this is the case because of additions. So I believe this may have been in the text in the beginning, although whoever wrote it first may not have been conscious of the other books that were written. It's likely that there were other sources in addition to the books that are in the canonical Bible, in various canonical Bibles. So whoever wrote Joshua, and it probably was not one person, also maybe wrote Judges, and also there were many additions made subsequently, probably by a different person or different people. These could have been priestly scholars, these could have been any number of people, but almost certainly Joshua, the book, was not written during the time when this is supposed to have taken place. So it would be almost roughly equivalent if in 2020 I'm trying to write a book on the Civil War and claiming absolute authority on what happened. I wasn't there, and I can use primary sources, but trying to say that General Lee wrote the book later, that's a later author attribution, and it's just not going to work that way. So keeping in mind that the time periods are off. The book of Joshua probably took place in, it was supposed to have taken place in 11th, 12th century BC. So very much before kingship, 200 years, 200 years before that time. The Philistines were still in that land, and the time is a bit hazy to these people. It's pretty clear. So in the beginning, too, of Joshua, it's stated, so this is Joshua 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, "My servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them. To the Israelites, every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given you, as promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all the land of the Hittites." And just to stop there for a second, the Hittites, they're not talking about Anatolians per se, people living in modern day Turkey. Biblical Hittites are a little bit different. So I might talk about that in a future video, but they're not exactly the Hittites that took over Egypt at one point. It's not exactly the same people. The land of the Hittites to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them. Only be strong and very courageous, being careful to act in accordance with the law. And so he goes on and he talks, God's talking to Joshua here. He's talking about the book of the law, which would be the Torah at this point, I guess, or some rough equivalent. May not be the Torah. But essentially, Joshua goes through, and I'm summarizing here, Joshua goes through, and there are essentially 15 cities. There's Debir, Hebron, Eglon, it's called Lachish, Libnah, Azekah, Jarmuth, Makkedah, Gezer, Ajalon, Upper Beth Horon, an unnamed city. I'm sorry, I don't know what the city's name is. Gilgal, Gibeon, Beeroth, and Jerusalem. Now, all of these cities are conquered or possessed by Joshua. The exception is Gibeon. The Gibeonites are said to pretty much make a formal appeal to Joshua, proclaiming the glory of the Lord, and pretty much supplicating themselves to Joshua, offering to be servants. And Joshua pretty much makes them all woodcutters. And that's supposed to be an origin of why those people, in whatever time this was written, were woodcutters. So to the readers, it's sort of an etiology and origin story of why the book of Joshua, so the book of Joshua explains why certain people have the rights they do, or they live in the certain places that they do. Another example of this in Joshua is Rahab. There are two men who are essentially spying on the inhabitants of Canaan, and they're going to be murdered, but there's a woman, a prostitute named Rahab, and so this woman is spared, and she is supposed to be just like an intermediary that saves them. Later, when they take over all these cities, Rahab is given land and her family is protected, and so the descendants of Rahab, it's explained why they are allowed to exist in Israel or Judah. Probably Judah, because it's in the southern section. So, at any rate, I have several questions or main problems with Joshua. They're not that simple, and this is part of my contention with the book of Joshua is that the historical narrative is essentially, it has all these historical elements that are hazy whether they're true or not, but they're presented to fill an audience into the overarching story of Israel and its inhabitants, and yet there are several questions that come up. The classic one is divine command theory, which I'll briefly explain and go over. And that the conquest is all divinely inspired. The conquest that Joshua goes over, and I'll go back over this. Essentially, Joshua goes out and it seems takes over all these cities by God's blessing. Now, God doesn't tell Joshua to go in and murder all the inhabitants of these various cities. And he doesn't do that. He does murder the inhabitants of most of the cities. Like I've said, the Gibeonites are the exception. They are not all murdered, because apparently Joshua thinks, it can be inferred that Joshua thinks the Gibeonites they believe in God, they're God-fearing peoples. Now, it's hard to know exactly what would have happened, but per the narrative, right, and this narrative is largely thought to be a pedantic piece of work rather than a completely accurate historical account. It's meant to teach future generations and people within the tribes. So it would seem that God is giving all the advice, and every single battle is ensured to be a successful outcome by God. It's actually said that in the text. What's not stated in the text, and correct me if I'm wrong, is like in the first part, he says, right, and this is Joshua 1:8. This book of the law shall not depart out of your mouth. You shall meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to act in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you shall make your way prosperous, and then you shall be successful. So I believe this means very strongly God saying whatever military endeavors you undertake, especially in the land that's been promised to you, I'll deliver your enemies into your hands. Now from there, it's up to them. It's up to Joshua what happens. Joshua is a military commander, and in this sense, he seems to be going in and ordering the death of a lot of different people. I mean, not a whole lot of figures are given. Mostly it's figures on the side of Joshua. So there'll be 5,000 soldiers here, 8,000 soldiers here. There's night raids, almost like Homer. This is almost like a military epic, but at the same time, it's pretty brutal. There's just a lot that's not very specific, and I'll probably return back to that, but it's just something that leave in the comments if you know more about this than I do, because I'd be really interested to learn. This is meant sort of as an introduction, but also as a introduction to the various problems that Joshua presents, and to the various problems and complications of the historical books as a whole. So Joshua, the book of Joshua, and it's not meant to be this way, but I find it very hard while reading the book of Joshua not to think of all the tactical errors that are being made. There are several cities with big walls, right? And there are mystical applications as to how these walls are taken down, but these walls are just destroyed systematically by Joshua's forces. Now, again, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't remember God saying anything that I read about destroy all these walls, destroy all the inhabitants, everyone has to die. Because that's not... I mean, the Gibeonites are left alive. God's not upset about that as far as I know. But God doesn't seem upset that all these inhabitants are being murdered, men and women. I don't think anywhere the children are mentioned to be killed, but in the text when it says all these people are being killed, it doesn't say, oh, but wait, all the children are alive. It says all these various people are killed, and God doesn't seem upset about that. And so that brings me back to divine command theory. My point with the tactical applications of Joshua is that in Judges, Israelite society is factional. So it's sort of like feudal. And there are various groups of people living in camps and living in tents and pretty much not living in a large fortified city. Well, when Joshua comes in, there are forts. There are, like, not castles necessarily, but there are walls, pretty much like inhabitable places ready to live in. And Joshua kills all the people and then destroys all the fortifications and inhabitable spaces, which to me makes no sense. And again, there may be more reasoning there. It's not meant to be a tactically cogent piece, but it just seems very strange to me. Again, this leads me to divine command theory, which I'll bring up, and then again, it just leads me to think, and again, these terms are different. They're based on Greek terms. Israelites had not made contact with Greeks. It wasn't meant for a modern audience, and I understand that. It's just that a lot of Joshua deals with genocide. And so, in a sense, the book of Joshua is like, here is the story of how the Israelite identity came to be, the state of Israel, as it was written during the time period, saying X amount of years ago, here's what happened. But it's pretty strange that they would try and write it so that this fierce warrior Joshua is coming in and destroying all these kings while not being a king himself, but pretty much systematically destroying smaller cultures. Seems pretty clearly a genocide. And again, I want to make it known that a lot of engagement in war, that sort of thing, comes from medieval philosophy. It comes from later philosophy that these people wouldn't have known about. It was not in the Near East. The people that they eventually would deal with, like Assyrians, these people are known for war crimes. It's just interesting how later books of the Bible are predicated on saying, woe is me, how bad is the world that we're all being murdered by these crazy people. But in effect, they did something very similar. Now, the difference with the Babylonians and Assyrians is that these people would do terrible things where they would come in and murder all these inhabitants, but they wouldn't kill everyone. Okay, Joshua was coming in and murdering everyone. The Babylonians, Assyrians would enslave large sections of their new empire, but they would use the people that they captured in terms of bureaucratic efficiency. So they would be making chariots or supporting their economy. Joshua's not even thinking about that. He's killing these people, killing people of various tribes and kingdoms, and taking their inhabitants, and taking all their possessions, and putting them in the royal treasury. And it's just very strange. Another thing that's different is the Babylonians and Assyrians would sow salt in the land so that you could not grow crops again. It's a very expensive, laborious task, especially at the time that they were doing it. So Joshua didn't do this either. It's just strange. Again, if somebody knows more about this, certainly somebody does, feel free to chime up. Now, with divine command theory is pretty much that one of two things is the case with God. Either what God orders is always morally correct, or that if what seems not morally correct, if God is ordering it, it somehow is, and that the limited perspective of a human is what is limiting someone from understanding why it is morally correct. The divine context or divine knowledge, which is far superior to human knowledge, supersedes the immoral way something may seem. But the relevance to Joshua is that God doesn't really command Joshua to murder everyone. He doesn't say go into 13 cities and murder these people, make it so there's no survivors. Another key point is that there's no trade networks here really in this part of these kingdoms. There's only like one. So later in the book, I think it's 11, after Joshua has destroyed all these people, there's 3 final cities. So this takes place actually in Joshua 10. So the Gibeonites have just surrendered and become allies to Joshua. And Joshua and 9, or actually in Joshua 8, Joshua's forces had destroyed Ai. So this is Joshua 10. When King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem heard how Joshua had taken Ai and utterly destroyed it, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king, and how the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among him, he became greatly frightened, because Gibeon was a large city, like one of the royal cities, and was larger than Ai. And its men were warriors. So King Adoni-Zedek of Jerusalem sent a message to King Hoham of Hebron, to King Piriam of Jarmuth, and to King Japhiah of Lachish, and to King Debir of Eglon, saying, "Come up and help me. Let us attack Gibeon, for it has made peace with Joshua and the Israelites." Now, this could be read in multiple different ways. I just can't help. These are like the last 5 or 6 cities. The rest and the region have been like all destroyed by Joshua, and one is allied with Joshua. So this is like a last-ditch effort for these pitiful kingdoms, really, that have no real chance but are trying to not be destroyed, because essentially all these kings are getting executed. All the inhabitants of these kingdoms are being executed. And so these kings are trying not to be murdered. I mean, so it's almost like, if anyone is familiar with Caesar essentially goes into Gaul and allies himself with various troops and starts pretty much systematically wiping out hundreds of thousands of people to conquer the province of Gaul, what would soon be the province of Gaul in Roman history. This is pretty similar here. I mean, it's pretty rough what's happening. I mean, essentially, if you don't ally with Joshua and you don't fear God, because if you try to ally with Joshua and you don't fear or love God, it doesn't seem like your odds are all that good. You get murdered. And if you try to fight him, like what's going to happen to these people, you get murdered as well. There's really no... It doesn't seem to be in the text that there's much of a hope for anybody else. It's pretty bleak, it's pretty dark, it's pretty dismal. And I just wasn't expecting this in the book of Joshua. It's pretty rough. So, and my point in bringing that up, among other things, was that trade routes are pretty scarce. This is the first example that I know of, at least in the local confederation of kingdoms out here that Joshua was fighting against. They don't have very well built trade networks. The cities that are in communication are pretty close to each other. So they happen to have known about the other cities, but only probably when Joshua was very close, because he's near this other city, which is Gibeon, and Gibeon is quite a bit closer to them. So they know some stuff is about to happen that's gonna really not be in their favor, and so they're just trying to prevent the utter destruction and deletion of their culture. And it's almost like the Israelites are the bad guys in this story, and it's very strange that they would portray themselves in this manner. And even when it's possibly not even historically accurate, it just seems strange that that would be a teaching point. Very odd to me. And in terms of divine command theory, I mean, what is the message here? Well, what is the message that God is trying to send? If you don't have land, kill everyone. I mean, it's almost like, do the ends justify the means? I mean, because the tribes of Israel, I don't think they were that populous. They could have stopped with three cities. There was habitable land outside of the 3 cities. Especially, it doesn't make sense to go in to Israel, Judah, all these provinces, kill all these inhabitants, and then destroy their walls and then live in tents. You could just live in tents in the desert. I'm not saying that it's really sustainable for them to have done that, but if they needed crops, they could have gone in and maybe taken over one city. Essentially, Joshua's forces are terrifying. I mean, they come in, they're like light infantry forces. They have no real siege engines or anything. And these walls are falling down. Now, that can be attributed to divine significance again. So, with the covenant, the Ark of the Covenant, Joshua has a special connection to that because he's supposed to be a prophet. There's a scene where he rips his clothes, which is sort of like a representative act among prophets. So Joshua maintains a role as this prophet, and he's an intermediary between the divine and the spirit and the natural world where humans live. And it's just like, whether it's they have a siege engine or this mystical Ark of the Covenant, whatever it is, when Joshua shows up, bad things happen, and in this sense, if you're not an Israelite, you better rethink your life. You better get out of there. It doesn't really seem like there's a whole lot of people that remain after the conquest of Canaan. It's just very strange. Hopefully I did a decent job of summarizing some of this, and I'll probably talk about Joshua in the future. If you have questions about the book of Joshua, as I do, please leave them down below, and I'll do my best to either make a companion video to answer them, or do future research, or point you in the right direction if I cannot find any better research. I think, too, there's one more thing I wanted to at least bring up. So I mentioned the Deuteronomic history, which was supposed to have been written in the context of all the disasters that overcame both kingdoms, being Israel and Judah, north and south. And these are supposed to be what happens when you don't heed prophetic warnings. So when God speaks to the prophet tells the people, and you don't do anything, bad things happen. Joshua and Judges are often thought to have been... they're clearly before the monarchy. They're before the kingdom of Israel is set up. But they are supposed to be very clearly structured in terms of ideas surrounding charismatic succession. So Joshua is a charismatic leader that comes out of the charismatic leadership of Moses. In the book of Judges, there are various leaders that are more tribal, but they hold various significances. They have a law. They have power over law. They have power over some military as evidenced by Joshua, but he seems to be sort of the minority in that sense. They have a somewhat prophetic connection, and so they have a lot of different versatilities, and they're very interesting figures. But that many leaders had military and judicial functions were raised up, and the last of whom was apparently Samuel in Judges 2:16 to 23 and 1 Samuel 12:11. The Deuteronomic history tests close links between prophets and rulers. From the death of Solomon to the fall of Jerusalem, prophets make frequent appearances to predict the fall of kings and dynasties for failure to observe Mosaic law. So I just want to make it clear that Joshua and Judges, and for that effect, most of the Deuteronomic history, sorry, I can't pronounce that, was written intentionally with very clear themes written out. Again, tactics were not the main concern here. It's more like if you, as I already stated, if you don't follow the word of God, there's bad things that are going to happen. And the judges and the prophets are one way in which you can verify if you're on the right track, at least with God. So, in terms of other things, again, questions, please leave them down below. I appreciate you watching, and if you made it to the end, if you like the content, please consider subscribing and checking out further things on the channel. I plan to do more biblical criticism and at least questions that I have on it. But I appreciate anyone who stayed this far. Thank you for watching.